In this video, you'll hear 6 chilling accounts of terrifying encounters in remote wilderness, all involving mysterious, towering creatures, from a brutal family attack to unexplained animal mutilations and bone-chilling warnings authorities won't fully explain. Could these gruesome incidents be the work of Bigfoot or something just like it? Join us and find out. Travis Myers had guided hunters and hikers for over 2 decades. At 51, he knew his way around the woods better than he knew his own house. Rugged, quiet, and fiercely private, he wasn't the type to panic easily. But nothing in all his years had prepared him for what he found when he snowshoed into a clearing deep in the Bitterroot Range of western Montana one frozen morning on November 27, 2019. He'd agreed to check on the Rileys, a family of 5 who had been off-grid for nearly a week past their expected return. Todd Riley was a former firefighter who'd moved his wife and 3 kids to a remote solar-powered cabin 2 years earlier. They hunted, fished, and homeschooled their kids, and though reclusive, they were known to be well-prepared and responsible. Travis trudged the last mile on foot, snow crunching beneath him. As the cabin came into view, a cold dread filled his chest. The front door was gone, not open, not broken, but missing entirely. Snow drifted in through the frame, and dark shapes littered the porch. The wood around the entrance was shredded, gouged by something far too large for a man or bear. Blood stained the snow, black in the shade of the trees. He drew his sidearm, stepped up to the doorframe, and scanned the shadows inside. The stench hit him first, something coppery, wet, and wrong. Inside, the walls were painted with blood. Furniture had been hurled across the room. A table was split in half like firewood. Claw marks gouged deep into the log walls ran at shoulder height, far too high for any known predator. Then he saw the bodies. Todd was face down near the fireplace, his skull crushed, spine exposed. His wife Karen lay in pieces near the pantry, limbs twisted unnaturally. The 2 oldest children, both boys, were found slumped against the far wall, their small bodies savaged. One had his chest ripped open, ribs cracked apart. The other's head had been caved in entirely. Travis backed out, heart pounding, stomach churning. He radioed the county sheriff and marked the site before throwing up in the snow. Search and rescue arrived by helicopter that afternoon. Deputies sealed off the area, but within hours, black SUVs and unmarked government-looking vehicles began rolling in. The site was treated like a biohazard. No one spoke much. The coroner ruled the deaths animal-related within 2 days, citing a rogue bear, though privately, several investigators expressed doubts. While clearing debris, a deputy pried open a floor panel near the bedroom. Inside, wrapped in a dirty blanket, they found the youngest Riley child, 7-year-old Ellie, shivering, dehydrated, and silent. She clung to a stuffed rabbit, eyes wide and distant, staring through everyone around her. Doctors said she was in shock. It took days before she spoke again. Her account didn't match the official story. She said the family had been eating dinner when something huge slammed into the door. Her father grabbed his rifle, but before he could fire, the creature crashed through. It was tall, taller than the doorframe, covered in black hair, and had glowing eyes that flickered in the candlelight. It moved with unnatural speed, its arms long, hands like shovels. It tore through the family in seconds. Ellie fled beneath the floorboards, curling into the crawl space while the sounds of screams, splintering wood, and cracking bones shook the walls above her. Then silence. She stayed there for 2 nights, too afraid to move, listening for footsteps she prayed wouldn't return. Authorities said her story was a trauma-induced hallucination. A therapist assigned to her case reported inconsistencies. The sheriff's office closed the case quietly, but those who had been on site, Travis included, weren't convinced. He remembered the size of the claw marks, the damage to the structure, the way the bones had been broken. No known bear had hands capable of grasping and ripping with that precision. No cougar could tear a steel latch straight out of a doorframe. There were no photos. Reports were redacted. The official story vanished from local news within a week. Travis tried talking to a wildlife biologist who had been flown in during the investigation. The man refused to comment, said he'd signed something, and walked away pale-faced. Months passed. The cabin was burned to the ground in what officials called a controlled decommissioning. The land was bought by a private company. Access was restricted. But the questions didn't stop. Hunters whispered about strange sounds in those woods, howls that didn't match wolves or cougars. Campers spoke of eyes watching from behind trees, massive prints that vanished into stone. And one trapper claimed he found a tree bent backwards and twisted off 10 feet up, with fur unlike anything he'd ever seen snagged in the bark. Travis couldn't let it go. He returned in spring, alone, retracing the trail to the cabin's ruins. Nothing remained but scorched soil and a blackened clearing. But not far from the site, he found something in the underbrush, an impression in the earth the size of a man's torso, shaped like a foot but broader, deeper, heavier. He followed them until they vanished into the cliffs. He never reported what he found. He didn't need to. The Rileys weren't killed by a bear. Not in 6 minutes. Not like that. The thing Ellie described, tall, fast, silent, and merciless, didn't kill for food. It didn't eat them. It tore them apart and left them. That wasn't hunger. That was rage. That was a warning. Travis quit guiding that summer. He moved to Idaho and kept to lowland hikes. He never entered deep woods alone again. Others could doubt the girl's story, believe the sheriff, or trust the news blackout. But he had seen the walls. He had seen the blood. And in his bones, he knew something else lived in those mountains. Something that didn't fear men or their cabins. Something that killed, not out of need, but because it could. And it had only taken 6 minutes. On the morning of September 4th, 2016, Frank and Linda Morgan were 6 months into traveling across the country in a second-hand RV they'd bought after retiring from their teaching jobs. The rhythm of the road had become their routine, coasting through winding highways, quiet breakfasts under awnings, and nights parked beside forgotten lakes or forest roads. Their latest stop was near a mist-covered lake tucked deep in a wooded basin in northern Idaho, far from any towns or campgrounds, and they'd chosen it precisely for its silence. On the second morning, before the sun had fully risen, Frank slipped out of the RV with his tackle box and rod, eager to fish while the water was still like glass. Linda stayed behind, enjoying the warmth of her blanket, not expecting anything unusual. She dozed for another hour before stepping out to make coffee, and as the fog began to lift from the lake's surface, she realized she could no longer see Frank's figure by the shoreline where he'd been the day before. Time passed, and a subtle unease began to rise in her chest. She walked the short path to the lake, calling for him, but only the soft lapping of water and the hiss of wind in the trees replied. That's when she saw it. His tackle box cracked open on the rocks, half submerged in the shallow, and his rod shattered nearby as though something had snapped it in one violent motion. A set of gouges tore into the wet earth, claw-like impressions that stretched into a trail of crushed reeds leading straight into the forest. Panic took hold, but instinct moved her feet forward. She followed the trampled path, heart pounding louder than the crunch of leaves beneath her boots, calling his name into the woods that swallowed sound. The forest was quiet, unnaturally so, as though the birds themselves had vanished. She found torn fragments of his flannel shirt snagged on branches, and broken limbs on saplings as if something massive had moved through at speed. Her breath grew sharp, chest tight with the fear that each step might reveal something too awful to bear. But then, 20 minutes into the trees, she saw him, Frank, crumpled at the base of a gnarled tree, one arm twisted at a strange angle, ribs heaving in shallow gasps, face bloodied and eyes half lost in confusion. He was alive, but barely, and it took everything in her not to scream as she dropped beside him. Later, when the panic had passed and his wounds were bandaged, he told her in fragments what had happened, how he'd been casting near the shore when a sudden crashing noise erupted behind him, too heavy to be deer, too fast for a bear, and before he could turn fully, something had grabbed him from behind. It lifted him like a child's doll and hurled him several yards across the shallows and into the brush. He didn't see much, but he remembered a dark silhouette, broader than any man, covered in long hair that hung wet and heavy, with arms far longer than they should have been and eyes that gleamed, not with the dull light of an animal, but with focus and judgment. It hadn't chased him. It hadn't finished what it started. For some reason, live. They left the lake that afternoon with Frank groaning in pain and Linda's hands trembling on the wheel. They didn't go to a hospital until they'd driven 2 hours south, far enough from the wilderness to feel the weight of that place begin to lift. The doctor who examined Frank's injuries called it a brutal fall, suggesting he'd been attacked by a startled bear, but neither of them mentioned the hand-shaped bruises on his upper arms, each one too wide, too human, too precise to be from claws or jaws. No report was filed, no authorities notified. The lake didn't have a name on most maps, and they'd told no one they were even camping there. For days after, they said little to each other about it. But Frank's breathing was uneasy at night, and Linda began checking the windows twice before turning in. Eventually, she started reading tales disturbingly similar to hers, always near lakes, always early in the morning, always ending with someone vanishing or barely surviving. What disturbed Linda most, though, was how often those stories described what she thought she'd imagined in the fog that morning. Just before she found Frank, she had looked up from the broken reeds and saw something far across the clearing, just beyond the last row of trees, a towering shape that moved not like a bear or elk, but like something walking upright with purpose, something that seemed to watch her without stepping closer. It had vanished before she could fully process it, but the shape stayed burned behind her eyes. They never returned to that place, and in the years since, Frank's injuries healed, but his time outdoors changed. He no longer fished alone, no longer woke before sunrise to disappear into the woods. Something in him had shifted, not from fear, but from respect. He often said quietly that there were places in the wild meant only for watching, not trespassing, and that morning at the lake had proven it. Even after all the time that had passed, Frank and Linda never returned to that lake, never set foot near those woods again, and never spoke openly about what they saw that night, because deep down, they both knew it was never meant to be witnessed, and if it ever came looking again, it wouldn't just let them go. On the evening of October 14, 2021, 3 college students set out for a weekend camping trip in the Umatilla Highlands of northeastern Oregon, a region known for its dense pine forests, steep terrain, and rarely marked trails. They had planned the trip for weeks, a quick escape from the routines of school life and the noise of the city. Devin, the tallest of the 3, was studying biology and had a deep love for wildlife, was majoring in anthropology and always carried a small note. Marcus, lean and quick-footed, was an engineering student who claimed he could build a shelter out of anything. They were close friends who had camped before, but never anywhere this remote. They hadn't been on that particular mountain before, and the trails leading to it weren't marked in any way they could find on maps or apps. They had heard about the spot from a student who grew up near the area and claimed it was beautiful and untouched, a place where you wouldn't hear another voice for days. That sounded perfect to them. They reached the foothills by mid-afternoon, parked their car in a clearing, and hiked in until the sun dipped behind the trees and the world turned gold with shadow. The first night was calm. They lit a fire, cooked sausages on sticks, and laughed about nothing in particular. Owls called from the canopy, and something large rustled in the distance once or twice, but nothing close enough to worry about. The second day they hiked higher, trying to find the top of a ridge where the view was supposed to be incredible, and though they never found it, they didn't mind. The woods were vast and ancient, thick with pine, moss, and silence so deep it pressed in on their ears. That night, everything changed. The air turned strangely still after sunset. The fire wouldn't stay lit, and Tara kept glancing over her shoulder, saying it felt like something was watching them. They dismissed it as nerves or too much caffeine, but Marcus said later that he'd noticed the same thing and just hadn't wanted to scare anyone. At some point near midnight, while the 3 of them were settling into their sleeping bags, the forest exploded with noise, branches snapping, dry leaves crackling, something fast and heavy moving through the underbrush on 2 legs, not 4. Devin had unzipped the tent to look, thinking maybe it was just a bear or a deer in distress, but what he saw made him freeze. A shape loomed at the edge of the firelight, tall and broad, hunched forward with arms too long and legs that bent wrong. It didn't move like any bear he had studied, and its face, while partially hidden in the dark, seemed flat with deep-set eyes that shined faintly. Before he could react, another shape stepped into view beside it, and this one exhaled a sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like a breath from something that had never learned language but knew how to signal dominance. They scrambled from the tent, leaving their shoes and gear behind, crashing into the woods in blind panic. They could hear the things following, not running but advancing fast, somehow knowing where they would turn before they even did. Branches slapped their faces, and thorns tore into their legs as they tried to put distance between themselves and those 2 shadows. Devin twisted his ankle early on but kept going, forced forward by Marcus's hand on his arm and Tara's voice urging them through the dark. They used every trick they knew, doubling back, crawling under fallen logs, covering their tracks near streams, but the sounds never fully faded. At one point, Marcus claimed he saw one of the creatures climb a low ridge and just stand there, watching them from above without chasing, as if it were studying how they moved, how they thought. The students pressed on through the night, following the pale glow of stars through the treetops, trying to find any sign of their car, but the forest had turned unfamiliar and endless. Hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. At dawn, they reached a slope that looked vaguely familiar, and as they stumbled down it, Tara screamed and pointed ahead. There was their car, sitting untouched in the clearing, and they limped toward it like survivors of some war they couldn't describe. Devin collapsed near the driver's side, his ankle swollen and purple, while Marcus pulled open the door and reached for the keys that were still tucked under the front mat. Before they could leave, something heavy landed near the rear bumper with a thud so deep it echoed through the trees. They turned and saw a large stone embedded in the soil just feet from the vehicle, too large to have fallen naturally from anywhere nearby. They didn't see anything in the woods beyond, but the message was clear. Their escape had been allowed, not missed. They drove in silence, trembling and bruised, barefoot and covered in dirt and blood from low-hanging branches. When they reached the nearest town, a clerk at a gas station called emergency services after seeing the state they were in. The students told a partial story. Strange noises, feeling hunted, two massive shapes in the trees, and the authorities wrote it off as an unusual encounter with possibly two bears, maybe starving or diseased, though no tracks were found around the campsite, and none of the claw marks matched anything in wildlife databases. The gear left behind was never recovered. When a search party visited the site, they claimed the camp had been flattened, the tent shredded as if by large hands, and the fire pit crushed into the soil. Investigators found no blood from the students, but did note odd impressions in the moss that looked more like human feet than paws, though they were nearly twice the length of a normal man's boot. Local tribal leaders weren't surprised. One elder later told a reporter, off the record, that the area had long been considered sacred and dangerous, watched over by what they called forest guardians, beings who protected the deep woods from intrusion and punished those who stayed too long. He said the students were lucky to be alive. None of the students forgot the way the woods felt that night, alive, aware, and full of something older than words. They told themselves they had survived through luck, instinct, or maybe some deeper mercy they didn't understand. But in quiet moments, when sleep refused to come, each of them knew they'd been allowed to leave, not because they'd outrun anything, but because something in those woods had chosen to let them go. Chase and Nolan had hunted black bear together for years, ever since their father first taught them to track fresh scat and spot claw marks on pine trunks in the deep timberlands of the Rhodope Mountains in southern Bulgaria, where the forest stretched endlessly beyond their hometown. It was October 18, 2016, and the season had been slow. Both in their 30s, they were seasoned outdoorsmen with lean frames hardened by years in the woods, and a quiet bond built from long days spent moving silently through the backcountry. After several fruitless outings in familiar areas, they decided to head deeper than usual, into the thick, remote valleys far past the logging roads, where the mountains folded in on themselves and cell service vanished completely. The day started well, with signs of fresh activity, scratches on saplings, overturned logs with clawed-out insect nests, and a musky odor in the air that kept them alert. They split up briefly, radioing back and forth, following separate ridges in hopes of catching something circling back through a ravine. By late afternoon, they hadn't seen a single bear, and when the sun dipped behind the western slope, they turned to meet at their designated point near a dry creek bed. That's when things went wrong. The map didn't match the terrain. The ridgeline they thought they'd crossed didn't exist, and the trail they followed vanished beneath windfall and scrub. Darkness came faster than expected, swallowing the woods in cold shadows as the temperature dropped. Their flashlights cast pale circles on moss-covered trunks, and every direction began to look the same. When Chase finally admitted they were turned around, Nolan just nodded and said they needed to find flat ground and wait for daylight. They made camp beneath a stand of cedar, not bothering with a fire since their packs had only bare essentials. Wrapped in emergency blankets, they leaned against their gear in the thick dark, heads on a pile of coats, rifles resting close. For a while, the woods were silent except for the wind and the occasional creak of trees shifting in the cold. Then, just past midnight, something changed. It began with a single crash, loud and deep, like something huge had slammed into a tree trunk. They sat up immediately, flashlights on, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Minutes later, the sound came again, this time closer, followed by the sharp crack of branches breaking under pressure. Whatever was moving wasn't small. It circled them slowly, always staying just beyond the reach of their lights, and each time it shifted direction they could hear how heavy it was. The ground itself seemed to carry the weight of its steps. Then came the stones. The first one was fist-sized, landing with a sharp thud in the dirt not far from where Chase sat. They both froze, barely breathing. Another followed, this one smaller, bouncing off a tree and rolling near their boots. Then came a larger one, hurled with such force it struck a low-hanging branch and shattered it, wood splinters raining down. Nolan swore under his breath, staring into the dark between trees, trying to find any shape that didn't belong. They huddled back to back, rifles up, flashlights scanning constantly, hearts pounding so loud they could barely hear. For hours, the sound circled them, crashing branches, shifting footsteps, an occasional low rumble that didn't sound like any bear they'd ever heard. And every now and then, another rock would land nearby, never close enough to hit, but always thrown with terrifying strength. Neither brother slept. By dawn, the forest had gone eerily quiet again, and the strange presence was gone. They gathered their gear quickly and headed downhill through wet underbrush, following the slope until at last, they saw the faint outline of their truck parked off a narrow dirt road they'd almost forgotten existed. They broke into a jog, the sight of it like a lifeline. But when they reached it, something made them stop cold. A massive stone, almost the size of a basketball, lay dented into the hood of the truck. The metal buckled deeply as if it had been dropped from high above or hurled with monstrous force. They examined the rock, felt its rough edges, and traced the crushed steel beneath it. It was far too large and heavy for any animal they knew to throw, and no human could have made that shot from the surrounding slope without using a machine. They looked around, scanning the tree line, but saw only the long shadows of dawn stretching between trunks. Neither of them spoke as they climbed inside and drove away in silence. For years they said nothing, not to friends, not to family. The story felt too strange, too wild to explain. They chalked it up to something unknown, something they weren't meant to understand, just a warning from the wilderness to never push too deep. But the memory stayed with them, heavy and vivid. Years later, when Nolan finally spoke about that night, he told only one part of what he'd seen. He said that near the darkest hour, when the crashing sounds were circling and Chase had turned his flashlight toward a thicket to the west, he'd looked in the opposite direction and caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong. Between two trees, far back where the light couldn't reach, he'd seen a figure. It was tall, much taller than a man, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung almost to its knees. It stood completely still, half hidden by the trunks, watching them. Its outline was blurred by shadow, but its size and stillness were impossible to forget. It hadn't moved, hadn't charged, hadn't made a sound, but it had watched them, and Nolan had felt deep in his chest that it could have done far worse than throw stones. It hadn't attacked. It had simply let them know they weren't alone. They never filed a report, never shared the location, never returned to that valley. The truck still bore the dent, though Chase eventually had the hood replaced. Nolan said they'd been warned, not by a predator, but by something else, something that didn't want to be seen, but made sure they understood where the line was. And after that hunt, they never again crossed it. On the morning of September 29, 2016, the cold wind sliced across the river valley where Luke and Ryan had spent countless hours fishing, a place far from roads or towns, deep in the wild expanses of the northern Carpathian Mountains in Romania, where the forests grew dense and the rivers ran cold and fast. Both in their early 30s, Luke was a rugged outdoorsman who'd grown up camping and fishing with his grandfather, knowing every bend of this river like the back of his weathered hands, while Ryan was a former wildlife biologist turned guide, whose sharp eyes and steady hands had saved them more than once when the wilderness turned unpredictable. They had returned here that morning, their favorite stretch of river sparkling under a crisp sun, carrying their gear quietly through the brush, ready for a long day of casting trout flies into deep pools. As they settled in near the water's edge, the thick forest around them felt unusually still, a heavy quiet that seemed to hold its breath. The river's rush was steady, but the usual songs of birds and rustle of small animals were missing, and an uneasy tension grew with the rising sun. The two men split up slightly, both walking along the riverbank in opposite directions, eyes scanning the ground for signs of trout or fresh casts to take advantage of the early morning feeding. It was Ryan who stumbled upon the first sign. Just off the narrow, leaf-strewn path that twisted beneath towering spruce and birch, he found a crushed animal carcass. A deer, its body ripped cleanly in half, the torn edges raw and jagged as if shredded by immense force. The remains looked unnatural, like the animal had been torn apart deliberately and laid out instead of attacked and left by a predator. Curiosity compelled him to follow the faint trail of blood and broken twigs deeper into the underbrush, his boots sinking softly into the damp earth. Moments later, Luke heard Ryan's sharp intake of breath and hurried over, his own gaze immediately drawn to what lay ahead, a circle of devastation, a macabre ring made up of half-eaten animal bodies spaced evenly in the clearing. There were raccoons, rabbits, even a large porcupine, each one brutally torn in half, their innards exposed, blood dark and thick staining the mossy ground beneath. The bodies were arranged in a rough circle nearly 20 feet wide, as if placed carefully rather than scattered in the frenzy of a kill. The scene was chilling, unnatural, and far too deliberate for the work of any ordinary animal. Luke's heart pounded as he crouched to examine the edges of the remains, noticing long claw marks gouged into nearby trees and large, deep scratches etched into the bark, too wide and too deep to have been made by a bear or wolf. The distinct impression of enormous footprints circled the clearing, some nearly 18 inches long, the shape unmistakable to a man who had tracked many wild animals, but never anything like this. Ryan, eyes wide with disbelief, whispered to Luke that the prints didn't match any known species in the region. Not a bear, not a cougar. Despite the fear tightening their chests, the two men knew they had to tell someone, but their account wasn't enough for the authorities. The response was swift and frustrating. The authorities claimed it was a freak bear attack, possibly caused by a bear afflicted with some unknown disease or extreme hunger, that led it to behave in an unusually violent and disorganized way. No mention was made of the strange prints, the careful arrangement of the carcasses, or the terrifying scope of the destruction. The official report painted the scene as a natural but unfortunate wildlife incident, a warning of the dangers of the wild, but nothing more. Luke and Ryan knew better. They never returned to that part of the riverbank. The memory of the circle of torn animal bodies haunted their dreams, the silent testimony of some creature lurking just beyond the edge of understanding, something that watched them from the shadows and warned them to stay away. Neither could forget the feeling of being watched as they stood there that morning, the sense that the forest itself was alive with something ancient and waiting, something strong and wild and aware. For days after, they talked quietly about the encounter, each replaying the images in their minds, the way the claws had scored the trees, the sheer size of the prints pressed deep into the mud, and the way the animals had been torn so cleanly in half, not by teeth, but by some overwhelming strength and deliberate action. It felt less like an animal's feeding frenzy and more like a warning, a message etched into the land in blood and bone. Locals in the nearby village whispered of strange noises in the night, eerie howls and the sound of heavy footsteps that shook the ground. Hunters spoke in hushed tones of a giant shadow moving silently between the trees, seen briefly at dawn but disappearing before any approach. No one wanted to go near the riverbank where the circle was found, and over time, the story became part of local legend, told only in whispers around campfires and never in detail, as if saying too much would draw unwanted attention. Luke and Ryan each tried to put their experience behind them, but the unease never left. Ryan returned to his work in wildlife biology, haunted by the knowledge that nature still held secrets beyond science's reach, while Luke's love of fishing and the outdoors dimmed, replaced by a cautious respect for the wild and what might still be watching beyond the trees. They both agreed silently, without ever needing to say so aloud, that some parts of the wilderness were not meant for humans to explore, that some forces were beyond understanding and far more dangerous than any bear or wolf. The river, once a place of peace and solace, had changed forever in their eyes. The quiet circle of death left on its bank was a dark reminder that in the wild, humans were not always the hunters, and sometimes the prey survived only by retreating into silence and shadows. They never set foot near that part of the river again, leaving the secret circle untouched, a grim boundary between the world they knew and the wild unknown that waited beyond. And as the seasons turned and the forest grew thick again, the quiet circle remained, a haunting testament to the power and mystery of a creature no one could name but all feared, a shadow cast long and deep over the land they once called home. In late October 2013, the dense Appalachian forest stretched endlessly behind the small cabin where Megan had lived alone for the past 5 years, nestled on the edge of the wilderness, where the trees grew thick and wild, and the sounds of nature filled every corner. Megan was no stranger to solitude or the rugged challenges of living near untamed land. A former nurse who had left the city for peace, she was tough and resourceful, used to handling emergencies alone. Her faithful dog, Bear, a large mixed breed with sharp instincts and a protective nature, was her constant companion, often patrolling the perimeter of their small clearing alongside her. One evening in late October, as the sun slipped below the horizon and the chill of night settled over the trees, Megan noticed Bear barking urgently outside the cabin. She had learned to trust those warning barks, for the forest around her held dangers she couldn't always see. Grabbing a flashlight, she stepped onto the porch just in time to witness something that shattered the fragile calm she had lived with for years. A massive creature, towering well over 8 feet tall and covered in thick, dark hair, moving upright like a man, suddenly lunged out from the shadows and snatched Bear from the edge of the clearing with a terrifying strength that sent the dog's barks into silence. Frozen for a moment, Megan's heart hammered as the creature disappeared swiftly into the dense woods, the dog's desperate whines fading behind it. The creature's broad shoulders and enormous hands had seemed almost unreal, as if it were something born of nightmare and legend, a hulking shadow with glowing eyes that caught the dim light. Panic surged through her, but she pushed it down quickly, knowing that waiting for help was not an option. The forest was too vast, and time was already slipping away. With her mind sharp and instinct screaming, Megan grabbed her hunting rifle from its rack and stepped into the woods, moving fast but carefully through the thick underbrush. The fading light made shadows dance, but she stayed focused, her eyes scanning for any sign of the creature or bear. Soon, she spotted the first clues, a trail of broken branches, disturbed leaves, and dark smears of blood marking the path deeper into the forest. Each step sent her heart racing, but she didn't hesitate. Driven by a mix of fear and determination that overrode exhaustion or doubt, the trail twisted through a maze of towering oaks and dense ferns, narrowing as she ventured farther from the safety of her cabin, the air growing colder and heavier with the scent of damp earth and decay. The silence of the forest was broken only by her careful footsteps and the distant cry of a lone owl, but Megan could feel the presence of something watching, a heavy gaze lurking just beyond the reach of her flashlight's beam. Her breathing slowed as adrenaline sharpened her senses, every nerve alert to the slightest sound or movement. After nearly an hour of following the trail, she emerged into a clearing surrounded by thick trees, where the moonlight revealed a scene that would haunt her forever. Bones lay scattered across the ground, some gnawed and broken, others cleanly picked, while tufts of dark fur clung to jagged rocks and splintered branches. The remains were not only those of bear, but also the remnants of livestock. Deer, sheep, and several cows that had gone missing from nearby farms over recent months. The animals' bodies were mutilated in a way that suggested no ordinary predator had been responsible. The cuts were precise, almost surgical, and the pattern of destruction was far too organized to be random. Megan's eyes swept over the grisly tableau, heart pounding in shock and revulsion, and she realized this was no typical animal attack. The circle of bones and fur seemed deliberate, as if some intelligence had arranged them, a warning or a message carved into the earth with teeth and claws. She bent down to examine one of the large footprints pressed deeply into the soft soil near the edge of the clearing, the shape unlike any bear or wolf track she had seen, too large and elongated, with fingers spread wide, like a human hand but massive and heavy. As she stood there, frozen in the moonlit clearing, she could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows at the tree line, a silent, threatening presence that held its breath and waited. It was as if the creature knew she had come, knew she was watching, and had spared her life for reasons she could not understand. The fear that gripped her was mixed with a strange, uneasy respect for the power and intelligence behind the brutal killings. Megan made her way back to the cabin as dawn began to break, careful to erase as much of her trail as possible, aware that any sign of her pursuit could bring the creature back or worse. She cleaned her wounds from the brambles and tried to steady her shaking hands as she loaded her rifle and prepared for the long days ahead. The experience had changed her forever. The forest no longer felt like a home, but a place where shadows lived and death walked upright. Despite her ordeal, Megan never reported the incident to the authorities. She had learned through years of living on the fringe that many reports of strange creatures or unusual attacks were dismissed, ridiculed, or quietly buried. Instead, she took to an anonymous online forum dedicated to unexplained animal disappearances and livestock mutilations, reading other accounts and warning others to stay away from the edges of the forest where the creature prowled. She knew her story matched countless others from the area, farmers who had lost animals, hikers who had glimpsed towering shadows, and hunters who returned with bruises and scratches but no clear explanation. For Megan, the warning was clear. This was a predator unlike any other, not just a wild animal, but a force of the forest itself, ancient and terrible, watching from the dark corners where humans did not belong. Over the weeks that followed, Megan fortified her cabin, setting traps and alarms, and kept Bear's absence as a silent scar beneath her skin. The loss was sharp, but her survival was a bitter victory against a foe that seemed to dwell between myth and reality. She knew that the creature's decision to spare her was a temporary reprieve, a warning that next time it might not be so merciful. Though she remained silent in public, Megan had become part of an invisible network, connected by fear and the need to survive, sharing stories that the world refused to see. Her experience was not an isolated one. It was part of a larger pattern, a shadow war between humans and something primal lurking just beyond the tree line. The creature that had taken Bear was not a monster born of nightmares alone, but a living force, a dark sentinel of the woods, powerful and aware, marking its territory with violence.